I'm Jen Faitang Quezon, and I was assigned to report the term structure of interest rates and the expectations theory. So let's proceed to the term structure of interest rates. So in previous topics, we have seen how risk, liquidity, and tax consideration can influence the interest rate. So there is also another factor that influence interest rate on a bond is its term to maturity. So bonds with identical risk, liquidity, and tax characteristics may have different interest rates since their time remaining is different. So let's proceed to the yield curve. A plot of the yields on bonds with differing terms to maturity but the same risk, liquidity, and tax consideration. So it describes the term structure of interest rates for particular types of bonds, such as government bonds. So this yield curve can be classified as upward sloping, flat, and downward sloping. So when you say upward sloping, when the yield curve slopes upward, which is the usual case, the most usual case, the long-term interest rates are above the short-term interest rates. So when you say flat, the short and long-term interest rates are the same. And when you say downward sloping, it is the opposite of the upward sloping. So it in which the long-term interest rates are below the short-term interest rates. So this is an example of yield curves for treasury securities, where vertical axis indicates the interest rates and the horizontal axis indicates the given maturity, with M denoting month and Y denoting year. So this is an example of government bonds. In figure 4, movements over time of interest rates and US government bonds with different maturities. Yield curve. Example of yield curve in 4 government bonds. So there are 3 theories that explains the term structure of interest rates, namely expectations theory, segmented markets theory, and liquidity premium theory. So I will discuss to you the expectations theory. So when you say expectations theory, the interest rate on a long-term bond will equal an average of the short-term interest rates that people expect to occur over the life of the long-term bond. So, for example, if the people expect that short-term interest rate will be 10% on average over the coming 5 years, the expectation theory predicts that the interest rate on bonds with 5 years to maturity will be 10% since the long-term interest the long-term bond will equal an average of the short-term interest rate. So, the key assumption of this theory is that buyers of bonds do not prefer bonds of one maturity over another, so they will not hold any quantity of a bond if its expected return is less than that of another bond with a different maturity. Bonds that have these characteristics are said to be perfect substitutes. This means that if bonds with different maturities are perfect substitute, the expected return on these bonds must be equal. So, in other words, the 2-year bonds must equal the average of the two 1-year interest rate. Example, if the current interest rate is 9% and the expected interest rate next year is 11%, so to get the average, you need to sum up the 9% and 11% and divide it into 2, which will equal to 10%. So, therefore, the interest rate on the 2-year bond must equal 10%. in a simple numerical example of expectation theory, if the 1 year interest rate over the next 5 years is expected to be 5%, 6%, 7%, 8%, and 9%, the interest rate on the 2 year bond would be 5.5%, since in which you add the 5% and 6% and divide it into 2, which is the um, period given, which is 2 years. So it will equal to 5.5%. And when you want to know when it comes to the 5 year, and for the 5 year bond, it would be 5% plus 6% plus 7% plus 8% plus 9%, and divided into 5, since it is a 5 year period, which is equal to 7%. So the expectation theory is an elegant theory that explains why the term structure of interest with why the term structure of interest rates changes at different times. So when the yield curve is upward sloping, it suggests that the expectation theory suggests that short-term interest rates are expected to rise in the future, and when and when and when the and when it will and when the yield curve slopes downward or inverted, it is the opposite of upward sloping. The short-term interest rate are expected to fall and up on average in the future. So when it is flat, the short-term interest rate are not expected to change. So the expectation theory explains that interest rates on bonds with different maturities move together over time, since long-term interest rates are the average of expected future short-term rates. So a rise in short-term rates will also raise long-term rates, causing short and long-term rates to move together. And the expectation theory also explains that yield curves tend to have an upward slope when short-term interest rates are low, and are inverted when short-term rates are high. So that would be all.